Chapter 11 of Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 11. No Way Out. The fairy palaces burst into illumination before pale morning showed the monstrous serpents of smoke trailing themselves over Coketown. A clattering of clogs upon the pavement, a rapid ringing of bells, and all the melancholy mad elephants, polished and oiled up for the day's monotony, were at their heavy exercise again. Stephen bent over his loom, quiet, watchful, and steady. A special contrast, as every man was in the forest of looms where Stephen worked, to the crashing, smashing, tearing piece of mechanism at which he laboured. Never fear, good people of an anxious turn of mind, that art will consign nature to oblivion. Set anywhere, side by side, the work of God and the work of man, and the former, even though it be a troop of hands of very small account, will gain in dignity from the comparison. So many hundred hands in this mill, so many hundred horse steam power. It is known, to the force of a single pound weight, what the engine will do. But not all the calculators of the national debt can tell me the capacity for good or evil, for love or hatred, for patriotism or discontent, for the decomposition of virtue into vice, or the reverse, at any single moment in the soul of one of these its quiet servants, with the composed faces and the regulated actions. There is no mystery in it. There is an unfathomable mystery in the meanest of them forever. Supposing we were to reverse our arithmetic for material objects, and to govern these awful unknown quantities by other means. The day grew strong, and showed itself outside, even against the flaming lights within. The lights were turned out, and the work went on. The rain fell, and the smoke serpents, submissive to the curse of all that tribe, trailed themselves upon the earth. In the waste-yard outside, the steam from the escape-pipe, the litter of barrels and old iron, the shining heaps of coals, the ashes everywhere, were shrouded in a veil of mist and rain. The work went on until the noon bell rang. More clattering upon the pavements. The looms and wheels and hands all out of gear for an hour. Stephen came out of the hot mill into the damp wind and cold wet streets, haggard and worn. He turned from his own class and his own quarter, taking nothing but a little bread as he walked along towards the hill on which his principal employer lived, in a red house with black outside shutters, green inside blinds, a black street door, up two white steps, Bounderby, in letters very like himself, upon a brazen plate, and a round brazen door-handle underneath it, like a brazen full stop. The Bounderby was at his lunch, so Stephen had expected. Would his servant say that one of the hands begged leave to speak to him? Message in return requiring name of such hand. Stephen Blackpool. There was nothing troublesome against Stephen Blackpool. Yes, he might come in. Stephen Blackpool in the parlour. Mr. Bounderby, whom he just knew by sight, at lunch on chop and sherry. Mrs. Sparsit netting at the fireside in a side-saddle attitude, with one foot in a cotton stirrup. It was a part at once of Mrs. Sparsit's dignity and service not to lunch. She supervised the meal officially, but implied that in her own stately person she considered lunch a weakness.
"Now, Stephen,"
said Mr. Bounderby,
"what's the matter with you?"
Stephen made a bow. Not a servile one. These hands will never do that. Lord bless you, sir, you'll never catch them at that, if they had been with you 20 years. And, as a complimentary toilet for Mrs. Sparsit, tucked his neckerchief ends into his waistcoat.
"Now you know,"
said Mr. Bounderby, taking some sherry,
"we have never had any difficulty with you. and you've never been one of the unreasonable ones. You don't expect to be set up in a coach and six, and to be fed on turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon, as many of 'em do."
Mr. Bounderby always represented this to be the sole, immediate, and direct object of any hand who was not entirely satisfied.
"And therefore I know already that you've not come here to make a complaint. Now, you know, I'm certain of that beforehand."
"No, sir. Sure I'll not come for nought kind."
Mr. Bounderby seemed agreeably surprised, notwithstanding his previous strong conviction.
"Very well,"
he returned.
"You're a steady hand, and I was not mistaken. Now, let me hear what it's all about. As it's not that, let me hear what it is. What have you got to say? Out with it, lad."
Stephen happened to glance towards Mrs. Sparsit.
"I can go, Mr. Bounderby, if you wish it,"
said that self-sacrificing lady, making a feint of taking her foot out of the stirrup. Mr. Bounderby stayed her by holding a mouthful of chop in suspension before swallowing it, and putting out his left hand. Then, withdrawing his hand and swallowing his mouthful of chop, he said to Stephen,
"Now, you know, this good lady is a born lady, a high lady. You're not to suppose, because she keeps my house for me, that she hasn't been very high up in the tree. Aye, up at the top of the tree. Now, if you've got anything to say that can't be said before a born lady, this lady will leave the room. If what you've got to say can be said before a born lady, this lady will stay where she is."
"Sir, I hope I never had nowt say not fitting for a born lady here sin I were a born mysen,"
was the reply, accompanied with a slight flush.
"Very well,"
said Mr. Bounderby, pushing away his plate and leaning back.
"Fire away."
"I come,"
Stephen began, raising his eyes from the floor after a moment's consideration,
"to ask you your advice. I need overmuch. I were married on Easter Monday 19 year sin, long and dree. She were a young lass, pretty enow, with good account of her sen. Well, she went bad soon. Nor along o' me. Gunnos I were nor an unkind husband to her."
"Now, I've heard all this before,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
"She took to drinking, left off working, sold the furniture, pawned the clothes, and played old gooseberry."
"I were patient wi' her."
"The more fool you, I think,"
said Mr. Bounderby, in confidence to his wine-glass.
"I were very patient wi' her. I tried wean her from it hour and hour again. I tried this, and I tried that, and I tried t'other. I gone home many time and found all vanished as I had it world. And how we has a sense left to bless her sen lying up bare ground. I had done not once, not twice, 20 time."
Every line in his face deepened as he said it, and put in its affecting evidence of the suffering he had undergone.
"From bad to worse, from worse to worsen, she left me. She disgraced hersen everyways, bitter and bad. She come back, she come back, she come back. What could I do to hinder her? I ha' walked streets nights long ere ever I'd go home. I gone to t' brig, minded to fling mysel' o'er, and I no more on't. I abhorred that much that I were owd when I were young."
Mrs. Sparsit, easily ambling along with her netting needles, raised the Coriolanian eyebrows and shook her head, as much as to say,
"The great no trouble as well as the small. Please to turn your humble eye in my direction."
"I ha' paid her to keep away from me. These 5 years I paid her. I ha' gotten decent fowtals about me again. I had lived hard and sad, but nor ashamed, and fearful a minutes o' my life. Last night I went home. There she lay upon th' hearthstone. There she is."
In the strength of his misfortune and the energy of his distress, he fired for the moment like a proud man. In another moment he stood as he had stood all the time, his usual stoop upon him, his pondering face addressed to Mr. Bounderby with a curious expression on it, half shrewd, half perplexed, as if his mind were set upon unravelling something very difficult, his hat held tight in his left hand, which rested on his hip, his right arm, with a rugged propriety and force of action, very earnestly emphasizing what he said, not least so when it always paused, a little bent, but not withdrawn, as he paused.
"I was acquainted with all this, you know,"
said Mr. Bounderby.
Except the last clause, long ago. It's a bad job, that's what it is. You had better been satisfied as you were, and not have got married. However, it's too late to say that.
Was it an unequal marriage, sir, in point of years?
Asked Mrs. Sparsit.
You hear what this lady asks. Was it an unequal marriage in point of years, this unlucky job of yours?
Asked Mr. Bounderby.
Nor e'en so. I were 21 mysen, and she were 20 now, but.
Indeed, sir,
said Mrs. Sparsit to her chef, with great placidity.
I inferred from its being so miserable a marriage that it was probably an unequal one in point of years.
Mr. Bounderby looked very hard at the good lady in a sidelong way that had an odd sheepishness about it. He fortified himself with a little more sherry.
Well, why don't you go on?
He then asked, turning rather irritably on Stephen Blackpool.
I come to ask you, sir, how I am to be rid of this woman.
Stephen infused a yet deeper gravity into the mixed expression of his attentive face. Mrs. Sparsit uttered a gentle ejaculation, as having received a moral shock.
What do you mean?
Said Bounderby, getting up to lean his back against the chimney-piece.
What are you talking about? You took her for better for worse.
I mun be rid of her. I can't bear no more. I have lived under it so long for that I hadn't had pity and comforting words at best last living or dead. Happily, but for her, I should have gone battering mad.
He wishes to be free, to marry the female of whom he speaks, I fear, sir,
observed Mrs. Sparsit in an undertone, and much dejected by the immorality of the people.
I do. Lady says what's right, I do. I were coming to it, and I read it papers that great folk, fair for to 'em, I wish 'em no hurt, are not bonded together for better for worse so fast that they can't be set free from the misfortunate marriages and marry o'er again. When they do not agree for that the tempers is ill sorted, they has rooms of one kind or another in their houses above a bit that they can live asunders. We folk hae only one room and we can't. When that won't do, they ha' gout and other cash, and they can say this for yo and that for me, and they can go their separate ways. We can't. Spite of all that, they can be set free for smaller wrongs than mine, so I mun be rid of this woman, and I want to know how.
Know how?
Returned Mr. Bounderby.
If I do any hurt, sir, there's a law to punish me.
Of course there is.
If I flee from her, there's a law to punish me.
Of course there is.
If I marry t'other dear lass, there's a law to punish me.
Of course there is.
If I were to live wi' her and not marry her, saying such things could be, which it never could or would, and her so good, there's a law to punish me and every innocent child belonging to me.
Of course there is.
Now, a God's name,
said Stephen Blackpool,
show me the law to help me.
There's a sanctity in this relation of life,
said Mr. Bounderby,
and it must be kept up.
No, dunna say that. Don't keep up that way, not that way. 'Tis kept down that way. I'm a weaver. I were in a factory when I were a child, but I ain't got neat to see wi, and I earn't to hear wi. I read it papers, every sizes, every sessions, and you can read too, I know it, with dismay, how th' supposed impossibility of getting unchained from one another at any price, on any terms, brings blood upon this land, and brings many common married folk to battle, murder, and sudden death. Let us have this right understood. Mine is a grievous case, and I want, if you will be so good, to know the law that helps me.
Now, I tell you what,
said Mr. Bounderby, putting his hands in his pockets.
There is such a law.
Stephen, subsiding into his quiet manner, and never wandering in his attention, gave a nod.
But it's not for you at all. It costs money. It costs a mint of money.
How much might that be?
Stephen calmly asked.
Why, you'd have to go to Doctors' Commons with a suit, and you'd have to go to a court of common law with a suit, and you'd have to go to the House of Lords with a suit, and you'd have to get an Act of Parliament to enable you to marry again, and it would cost you, if it was a case of very plain sailing, I suppose from 1,000 to 1,500 pound,
said Mr. Bounderby.
Perhaps twice the money.
There's no other law?
Certainly not.
Why then, sir?
said Stephen, turning white, and motioning with that right hand of his, as if he gave everything to the four winds.
'Tis a muddle. 'Tis just a muddle altogether, and the sooner I'm dead the better.
Mrs. Sparsit again dejected by the impiety of the people.
Oh, don't you talk nonsense, my good fellow,
said Mr. Bounderby,
about things you don't understand. And don't you call the institutions of your country a muddle, or you'll get yourself into a real muddle one of these fine mornings. The institutions of your country are not your piecework, and the only thing you've got to do is to mind your piecework. You didn't take your wife for fast and for loose, but for better for worse. If she's turned out worse, why, all we've got to say is, she might have turned out better.
'Tis a muddle,
said Stephen, shaking his head as he moved to the door.
'Tis a muddle.
Now I'll tell you what,
Mr. Bounderby resumed, as a valedictory address.
with what I shall call your unhallowed opinions, you've been quite shocking this lady, who, as I've already told you, is a born lady, and who, as I've not already told you, has had her own marriage misfortunes, to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. Tens of thousands of pounds.
He repeated it with great relish.
Now, you've always been a steady hand heretofore, but my opinion is, and so I tell you plainly, that you are turning into the wrong road. You've been listening to some mischievous stranger or other. They're always about, and the best thing you can do is to come out of that. Now, you know, I can see as far into a grindstone as any other man, farther than a good many, perhaps, because I had my nose well kept to it when I were young. I see traces of the turtle soup and venison and gold spoon in this. Yes, I do,
cried Mr. Bounderby, shaking his head with obstinate cunning.
by the Lord Harry, I do.
With a very different shake of the head and deep sigh, Stephen said,
Thank you, sir. I wish you good day.
So he left Mr. Bounderby swelling at his own portrait on the wall, as if he were going to explode himself into it, and Mrs. Sparsit still ambling on with her foot in her stirrup, looking quite cast down by the popular vices. Chapter 11. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12. The Old Woman. Old Stephen descended the 2 white steps, shutting the black door with the brazen door-plate by the aid of the brazen full-stop, to which he gave a parting polish with the sleeve of his coat, observing that his hot hand clouded it. He crossed the street with his eyes bent upon the ground, and thus was walking sorrowfully away, when he felt a touch upon his arm. It was not the touch he needed most at such a moment, the touch that could calm the wild waters of his soul, as the uplifted hand of the sublimest love and patience could abate the raging of the sea. Yet it was a woman's hand too. It was an old woman, tall and shapely still, though withered by time, on whom his eyes fell when he stopped and turned. She was very cleanly and plainly dressed, had country mud upon her shoes, and was newly come from a journey. The flutter of her manner in the unwonted noise of the streets, the spare shawl carried unfolded on her arm, the heavy umbrella and little basket, the loose long-fingered gloves to which her hands were unused, all bespoke an old woman from the country in her plain holiday clothes, come into Coketown on an expedition of rare occurrence. Remarking this at a glance, with the quick observation of his class, Stephen Blackpool bent his attentive face, which, like the faces of many of his order, by dint of long working with eyes and hands in the midst of a prodigious noise, had acquired the concentrated look with which we are familiar in the countenances of the deaf, the better to hear what she asked him.
"Pray, sir,"
said the old woman,
"didn't I see you come out of that gentleman's house?"
pointing back to Mr. Bounderby.
"I believe it was you, unless I've had the bad luck to mistake the person in following."
Yes, missus,
returned Stephen.
it were me.
"Have you'll excuse an old woman's curiosity, have you seen the gentleman?
Yes, missus.
And how did he look, sir? Was he portly, bold, outspoken and hearty?"
As she straightened her own figure, and held up her hand in adapting her action to her words, the idea crossed Stephen that he had seen this old woman before, and had not quite liked her.
Oh, yes,
he returned, observing her more attentively.
He were all that.
"And healthy?"
said the old woman.
"As fresh as the wind?"
Yes,
returned Stephen.
He were eating and drinking, as large and as loud as Hummerby.
"Thank you,"
said the old woman, with infinite content.
"Thank you."
He certainly never had seen this old woman before, yet there was a vague remembrance in his mind, as if he had more than once dreamed of some old woman like her. She walked along at his side, and gently accommodating himself to her humour, he said Coketown was a busy place, was it not? To which she answered,
"Ay, sure, dreadful busy."
Then, he said, she came from the country, he saw? To which she answered in the affirmative.
"By Parliamentary this morning. I came 40 mile by Parliamentary this morning, and I'm going back the same 40 mile this afternoon. I walked 9 mile to the station this morning, and if I find nobody on the road to give me a lift, I shall walk the 9 mile back tonight. That's pretty well, sir, at my age,"
said the chatty old woman, her eye brightening with exultation.
"'Deed it is. Don't do it too often, missus."
"No, no, once a year,"
she answered, shaking her head.
"I spend my savings so once every year. I come regular to tramp about the streets and see the gentlemen."
"Only to see 'em?"
returned Stephen.
"That's enough for me,"
she replied, with great earnestness and interest of manner.
"I ask no more. I've been standing about on this side of the way to see that gentleman,"
turning her head back towards Mr. Bounderby's again.
"come out, but he's late this year, and I have not seen him. You came out instead. Now, if I am obliged to go back without a glimpse of him, I only want a glimpse. Well, I have seen you, and you have seen him, and I must make that do."
Saying this, she looked at Stephen as if to fix his features in her mind, and her eye was not so bright as it had been. With a large allowance for difference of tastes, and with all submission to the patricians of Coketown, this seemed so extraordinary a source of interest to take so much trouble about, that it perplexed him. But they were passing the church now, and as his eye caught the clock, he quickened his pace. He was going to work, the old woman said, quickening hers too, quite easily. Yes, time was nearly out. On his telling her where he worked, the old woman became a more singular old woman than before.
"Ain't you happy?"
she asked him.
"Why, there's almost nobody but has the troubles, missus."
He answered evasively, because the old woman appeared to take it for granted that he would be very happy indeed, and he had not the heart to disappoint her. He knew that there was trouble enough in the world, and if the old woman had lived so long, and could count upon his having so little, why, so much the better for her, and none the worse for him.
"Ay, ay. You have your troubles at home, you mean?"
she said.
"Times, just now and then,"
he answered slightly.
"But working under such a gentleman, they don't follow you to the factory?"
No, they didn't follow him there, said Stephen. All correct there, everything accordant there. He did not go so far as to say, for her pleasure, that there was a sort of divine right there, but I have heard claims almost as magnificent of late years. They were now in the black by-road near the place, and the hands were crowding in. The bell was ringing, and the serpent was a serpent of many coils, and the elephant was getting ready. The strange old woman was delighted with the very bell. It was the beautifulest bell she had ever heard, she said, and sounded grand. She asked him, when he stopped good-naturedly to shake hands with her before going in, how long he had worked there.
12 year,
he told her.
I must kiss the hand,
said she,
that has worked in this fine factory for 12 year.
And she lifted it, though he would have prevented her, and put it to her lips. What harmony besides her age and her simplicity surrounded her, he did not know, but even in this fantastic action there was a something neither out of time nor place, a something which it seemed as if nobody else could have made as serious, or done with such a natural and touching air. He had been at his loom full half an hour, thinking about this old woman, when, having occasion to move round the loom for its adjustment, he glanced through the window which was in his corner, and saw her still looking up at the pile of building, lost in admiration. Heedless of the smoke and mud and wet, and of her 2 long journeys, she was gazing at it, as if the heavy thrum that issued from its many stories were proud music to her. She was gone by and by, and the day went after her, and the lights sprung up again, and the express whirled in full sight of the fairy palace over the arches near, little felt amid the jarring of the machinery, and scarcely heard above its crash and rattle. Long before then his thoughts had gone back to the dreary room above the little shop, and to the shameful figure, heavy on the bed, but heavier on his heart. Machinery slackened, throbbing feebly like a fainting pulse, stopped. The bell again. The glare of light and heat dispelled. The factories looming heavy in the black wet night, their tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel. He had spoken to Rachel only last night, it was true, and had walked with her a little way, but he had his new misfortune on him, in which no one else could give him a moment's relief, and for the sake of it, and because he knew himself to want that softening of his anger which no voice but hers could effect, he felt he might so far disregard what she had said as to wait for her again. He waited, but she had eluded him. She was gone. On no other night in the year could he so ill have spared her patient face. Oh, better to have no home in which to lay his head, than to have a home, and dread to go to it, through such a cause. He ate and drank, for he was exhausted, but he little knew or cared what. And he wandered about in the chill rain, thinking and thinking, and brooding and brooding. No word of a new marriage had ever passed between them, but Rachel had taken great pity on him years ago, and to her alone he had opened his closed heart all this time on the subject of his miseries, and he knew very well that if he were free to ask her, she would take him. He thought of the home he might at that moment have been seeking with pleasure and pride, of the different man he might have been that night, of the lightness then in his now heavy-laden breast, of the then restored honour, self-respect, and tranquillity, all torn to pieces. He thought of the waste of the best part of his life, of the change it made in his character for the worse every day, of the dreadful nature of his existence, bound hand and foot to a dead woman, and tormented by a demon in her shape. He thought of Rachel, how young when they were first brought together in these circumstances, how mature now, how soon to grow old. He thought of the number of girls and women she had seen marry, how many homes with children in them she had seen grow up around her, how she had contentedly pursued her own lone quiet path for him, and how he had sometimes seen a shade of melancholy on her blessed face that smote him with remorse and despair. He set the picture of her up beside the infamous image of last night, and thought, could it be that the whole earthly course of one so gentle, good, and self-denying was subjugate to such a wretch as that? Filled with these thoughts, so filled that he had an unwholesome sense of growing larger, of being placed in some new and diseased relation towards the objects among which he passed, of seeing the iris round every misty light turn red, he went home for shelter. Chapter 12. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 13. Rachel. A candle faintly burned in the window to which the black ladder had often been raised for the sliding away of all that was most precious in this world to a striving wife and a brood of hungry babies, and Stephen added to his other thoughts the stern reflection that of all the casualties of this existence upon earth not one was dealt out with so unequal a hand as death. The inequality of birth was nothing to it. For say that the child of a king and the child of a weaver were born to-night in the same moment, what was that disparity to the death of any human creature who was serviceable to or beloved by another, while this abandoned woman lived on? From the outside of his home he gloomily passed to the inside, with suspended breath, and with a slow footstep. He went up to his door, opened it, and so into the room. Quiet and peace were there. Rachel was there, sitting by the bed. She turned her head, and the light of her face shone in upon the midnight of his mind. She sat by the bed, watching and tending his wife. That is to say, he saw that some one lay there, and he knew too well it must be she. But Rachel's hands had put a curtain up, so that she was screened from his eyes. Her disgraceful garments were removed, and some of Rachel's were in the room. Everything was in its place and order as he had always kept it. The little fire was newly trimmed, and the hearth was freshly swept. It appeared to him that he saw all this in Rachel's face, and looked at nothing besides. While looking at it, it was shut out from his view by the softened tears that filled his eyes, but not before he had seen how earnestly she looked at him, and how her own eyes were filled too. She turned again towards the bed, and satisfying herself that all was quiet there, spoke in a low, calm, cheerful voice.
"I am glad you have come at last, Stephen. You are very late."
I have been walking up and down.
"I thought so. But 'tis too bad a night for that. The rain falls very heavy, and the wind has risen."
The wind? True, it was blowing hard. Hark to the thundering in the chimney, and the surging noise! To have been out in such a wind, and not to have known it was blowing!
"I have been here once before to-day, Stephen. Landlady came round for me at dinner-time. There was someone here that needed looking to, she said. And 'deed she was right. All wandering and lost, Stephen. Wounded too, and bruised."
He slowly moved to a chair and sat down, drooping his head before her.
I came to do what little I could, Stephen. First, for that she worked with me when we were girls both, and for that you courted her and married her when I was her friend."
He laid his furrowed forehead on his hand, with a low groan.
"And next, for that I know your heart, and am right sure and certain that 'tis far too merciful to let her die, or even so much as suffer for want of aid. Thou knowst who said, 'Let him who is without sin amongst you cast the first stone at her.' There have been plenty to do that. Thou'rt not the man to cast the last stone, Stephen, when she is brought so low."
"Oh, Rachel, Rachel!"
"Thou hast been a cruel sufferer, heaven reward thee,"
she said, in compassionate accents.
"I am thy poor friend with all my heart and mind."
The wounds of which she had spoken seemed to be about the neck of the self-made outcast. She dressed them now, still without showing her. She steeped a piece of linen in a basin, into which she poured some liquid from a bottle, and laid it with a gentle hand upon the sore. The three-legged table had been drawn close to the bedside, and on it there were 2 bottles. This was one. It was not so far off but that Stephen, following her hands with his eyes, could read what was printed on it in large letters. He turned of a deadly hue, and a sudden horror seemed to fall upon him.
"I will stay here, Stephen,"
said Rachel, quietly resuming her seat,
"till the bells go 3. 'Tis to be done again at 3, and then she may be left till morning."
"But thy rest again. To-morrow's work, my dear."
"I slept sound last night. I can wake many nights when I am put to it. 'Tis thou who art in need of rest, so white and tired. Try to sleep in the chair there while I watch. Thou hadst no sleep last night, I can well believe. To-morrow's work is far harder for thee than for me."
He heard the thundering and surging out of doors, and it seemed to him as if his late angry mood were going about trying to get at him. She had cast it out, she would keep it out. He trusted to her to defend him from himself.
"She don't know me, Stephen. She just drowsily mutters and stares. I have spoken to her times and again, but she don't notice. 'Tis as well so. When she comes to her right mind once more, I shall have done what I can, and she never the wiser."
"How long, Rachel, this look for, that she'll be so?"
"Doctors said she would haply come to her mind to-morrow."
His eyes fell again on the bottle, and a tremble passed over him, causing him to shiver in every limb. She thought he was chilled with the wet.
"No,"
he said.
"it were not that. He'd had a fright."
"A fright?"
"Aye, aye, coming in, when I were walking, when I were thinking, when I—"
It seized him again, and he stood up, holding by the mantel-shelf, as he pressed his dank, cold hair down with a hand that shook as if it were palsied.
"Stephen!"
She was coming to him, but he stretched out his arm to stop her.
"No, don't, please don't. Let me see thee setting by bed. Let me see thee as so good and so forgiving. Let me see thee as I see thee when I coming in. I can never see thee better than so. Never, never, never."
He had a violent fit of trembling, and then sunk into his chair. After a time he controlled himself, and resting, with an elbow on one knee and his head upon that hand, could look towards Rachel. Seen across the dim candle, with his moistened eyes, she looked as if she had a glory shining round her head. He could have believed she had. He did believe it, as the noise without shook the window, rattled at the door below, and went about the house clamouring and lamenting.
"When she gets better, Stephen, 'tis to be hoped she'll leave thee to thyself again, and do thee no more hurt. Anyways, we will hope so now. And now I shall keep silence, for I want thee to sleep."
He closed his eyes, more to please her than to rest his weary head. But by slow degrees, as he listened to the great noise of the wind, he ceased to hear it, or it changed into the working of his loom, or even into the voices of the day, his own included, saying what had been really said. Even this imperfect consciousness faded away at last, and he dreamed a long, troubled dream. He thought that he and some one on whom his heart had long been set But she was not Rachel, and that surprised him, even in the midst of his imaginary happiness, stood in the church being married. While the ceremony was performing, and while he recognized among the witnesses some whom he knew to be living, and many whom he knew to be dead, darkness came on, succeeded by the shining of a tremendous light. It broke from one line in the table of commandments at the altar, and illuminated the building with the words. They were sounded through the church, too, as if there were voices in the fiery letters. Upon this the whole appearance before him and around him changed, and nothing was left as it had been but himself and the clergyman. They stood in the daylight, before a crowd so vast that if all the people in the world could have been brought together into one space, they could not have looked, he thought, more numerous, and they all abhorred him, and there was not one pitying or friendly eye among the millions that were fastened on his face. He stood on a raised stage, under his own loom, and looking up at the shape the loom took, and hearing the burial service distinctly read, he knew that he was there to suffer death. In an instant what he stood on fell below him, and he was gone. Out of what mystery he came back to his usual life, and to places that he knew, he was unable to consider. But he was back in those places by some means, and with this condemnation upon him, that he was never, in this world or the next, through all the unimaginable ages of eternity, to look on Rachel's face or hear her voice. Wandering to and fro unceasingly, without hope, and in search of he knew not what, he only knew that he was doomed to seek it, he was the subject of a nameless, horrible dread, a mortal fear of one particular shape which everything took. Whatsoever he looked at grew into that form sooner or later. The object of his miserable existence was to prevent its recognition by any one among the various people he encountered. Hopeless labor! If he led them out of rooms where it was, if he shut up drawers and closets where it stood, if he drew the curious from places where he knew it to be secreted, and got them out into the streets, the very chimneys of the mills assumed that shape, and round them was the printed word. The wind was blowing again, the rain was beating on the housetops, and the larger spaces through which he had strayed contracted to the four walls of his room. Saving that the fire had died out, it was as his eyes had closed upon it. Rachel seemed to have fallen into a doze in the chair by the bed. She sat wrapped in her shawl, perfectly still. The table stood in the same place, close by the bedside, and on it, in its real proportions and appearance, was the shape so often repeated. He thought he saw the curtain move. He looked again, and he was sure it moved. He saw a hand come forth and grope about a little. Then the curtain moved more perceptibly, and the woman in the bed put it back and sat up. With her woeful eyes, so haggard and wild, so heavy and large, she looked all round the room, and past the corner where he slept in his chair. Her eyes returned to that corner, and she put her hand over them as a shade, while she looked into it. Again they went all round the room, scarcely heeding Rachel, if at all, and returned to that corner. He thought, as she once more shaded them, not so much looking at him as looking for him, with a brutish instinct that he was there, that no single trace was left in those debauched features, or in the mind that went along with them, of the woman he had married 18 years before. But that he had seen her come to this by inches, he never could have believed her to be the same. All this time, as if a spell were on him, he was motionless and powerless, except to watch her. stupidly dozing, or communing with her incapable self about nothing, she sat for a little while with her hands at her ears, and her head resting on them. Presently she resumed her staring round the room, and now, for the first time, her eyes stopped at the table with the bottles on it. Straightway she turned her eyes back to his corner, with the defiance of last night, and moving very cautiously and softly, stretched out her greedy hand. She drew a mug into the bed, and sat for a while considering which of the two bottles she would choose. Finally she laid her insensate grasp upon the bottle that had swift and certain death in it, and before his eyes pulled out the cork with her teeth. Dream or reality, he had no voice, nor had he power to stir. If this be real, and her allotted time be not yet come, wake, Rachel, wake. She thought of that too. She looked at Rachel, and very slowly, very cautiously, poured out the contents. The draught was at her lips. A moment, and she would be past all help, let the whole world wake and come about her with its utmost power. But in that moment Rachel started up with a suppressed cry. The creature struggled, struck her, seized her by the hair, but Rachel had the cup. Stephen broke out of his chair.
Rachel, am I waking or dreaming this dreadful night?
'Tis all well, Stephen. I have been asleep myself. 'Tis near 3. Hush! I hear the bells.
The wind brought the sounds of the church clock to the window. They listened, and it struck 3. Stephen looked at her, saw how pale she was, noted the disorder of her hair and the red marks of fingers on her forehead, and felt assured that his senses of sight and hearing had been awake. She held the cup in her hand even now.
I thought it must be near 3,
she said, calmly pouring from the cup into the basin, and steeping the linen as before.
I am thankful I stayed. 'Tis done now, when I've put this on. There. And now she's quiet again. The few drops in the basin I'll pour away, for 'tis bad stuff to leave about, though ever so little of it.
As she spoke, she drained the basin into the ashes of the fire, broke the bottle on the hearth. She had nothing to do then but to cover herself with her shawl, before going out into the wind and rain.
They'll let me walk with you at this hour, Rachel?
No, Stephen. 'Tis but a minute, and I'm home.
They are not fearful.
He said it in a low voice, as they went out at the door.
To leave me alone with you?
As she looked at him, saying,
Stephen.
He went down on his knee before her, on the poor mean stairs, and put an end of her shawl to his lips.
Thou art an angel, bless thee, bless thee.
I am, as I have told thee, Stephen, thy poor friend. Angels are not like me. Between them and a working woman full of faults there is a deep gulf set. My little sister is among them, but she is changed.
She raised her eyes for a moment as she said the words, and then they fell again, in all their gentleness and mildness, on his face.
Thou changest me from bad to good. Thou makest me humble, wish for to be more like thee, and fearful to lose thee when this life is o'er, and all t' muddle cleared away. Thou art an angel. It may be thou hast saved my soul alive.
She looked at him, on his knee at her feet, with her shawl still in his hand, and the reproof on her lips died away when she saw the working of his face.
I come home desperate. I come home without a hope, and mad with thinking that when I said a word of complaint I was reckoned an unreasonable hand. I told thee I'd had a fright. It were the poison bottle on table. I never hurt a living creature, but happening so sudden upon it, I thought, how can I say what I might have done to mysen, or her, or both?
She put her 2 hands on his mouth, with a face of terror, to stop him from saying more. He caught them in his unoccupied hand, and holding them, and still clasping the border of her shawl, said hurriedly,
but I see thee, Rachel, setting by the bed. I ha' seen thee all this night. In my troublous sleep I ha' known thee still be there. Evermore I'll see thee there. I never more will see her or think of her, but thou shalt be beside her. I never more will see or think of anything that angers me, but thou, so much better than me, shall be by the side on't, and so I'll try to look to time, and so I will try to trust to time, when thou and me at last shall walk together far away, beyond the deep gulfic country where thy little sister is.
He kissed the border of her shawl again, and let her go. She bade him good night in a broken voice, and went out into the street. The wind blew from the quarter where the day would soon appear, and still blew strongly. It had cleared the sky before it, and the rain had spent itself or travelled elsewhere, and the stars were bright. He stood bareheaded in the road, watching her quick disappearance. As the shining stars were to the heavy candle in the window, so was Rachel, in the rugged fancy of this man, to the common experiences of his life. End of chapter 13. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 14. The Great Manufacturer. Time went on in Coketown like its own machinery. So much material wrought up, so much fuel consumed, so many powers worn out, so much money made. But, less inexorable than iron, steel, and brass, it brought its varying seasons even into that wilderness of smoke and brick, and made the only stand that ever was made in the place against its direful uniformity.
"Louisa is becoming,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"almost a young woman."
Time, with his innumerable horsepower, worked away, not minding what anybody said, and presently turned out young Thomas a foot taller than when his father had last taken particular notice of him.
"Thomas is becoming,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"almost a young man."
Time passed Thomas on in the mill, while his father was thinking about it, and there he stood in a long-tailed coat and a stiff shirt-collar.
"Really,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"the period has arrived when Thomas ought to go to Bounderby."
Time, sticking to him, passed him on into Bounderby's bank, made him an inmate of Bounderby's house, necessitated the purchase of his first razor, and exercised him diligently in his calculations relative to number 1. The same great manufacturer, always with an immense variety of work on hand in every stage of development, passed Sissy onward in his mill, and worked her up into a very pretty article indeed.
"I fear, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"that your continuance at the school any longer would be useless."
"I am afraid it would, sir,"
Sissy answered, with a curtsey.
"I cannot disguise from you, Jupe,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, knitting his brow,
"that the result of your probation there has disappointed me, has greatly disappointed me. You have not acquired under Mr. and Mrs. M'Choakumchild anything like that amount of exact knowledge which I looked for. You are extremely deficient in your facts. Your acquaintance with figures is very limited. You are altogether backward and below the mark."
"I am sorry, sir,"
she returned,
"but I know it is quite true. Yet I have tried hard, sir."
"Yes,"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"Yes, I believe you have tried hard. I have observed you, and I can find no fault in that respect."
"Thank you, sir. I have thought sometimes,"
Sissy very timid here,
"that perhaps I tried to learn too much, and that if I had asked to be allowed to try a little less, I might have—"
"No, Jupe, no,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, shaking his head in his profoundest and most eminently practical way.
No, the course you pursued according to the system. The system, and there is no more to be said about it. I can only suppose that the circumstances of your early life were too unfavorable to the development of your reasoning powers, and that we began too late. Yet, as I have said already, I am disappointed.
I wish I could have made a better acknowledgment, sir, of your kindness to a poor forlorn girl who had no claim upon you, and of your protection of her.
Don't shed tears,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
Don't shed tears. I don't complain of you. You are an affectionate, earnest, good young woman, and we must make that do.
Thank you, sir, very much,
said Sissy, with a grateful curtsy.
You are very useful to Mrs. Gradgrind, and in a generally pervading way you are serviceable in the family also. So I understand from Miss Louisa, and indeed so I have observed myself. I therefore hope,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
that you can make yourself happy in those relations.
I should have nothing to wish, sir, if—
I understand you,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
You still refer to your father. I have heard from Miss Louisa that you still preserve that bottle. Well, if your training in the science of arriving at exact results had been more successful, you would have been wiser on these points. I will say no more.
He really liked Sissy too well to have a contempt for her. Otherwise he held her calculating powers in such very slight estimation that he must have fallen upon that conclusion. Somehow or other he had become possessed by an idea that there was something in this girl which could hardly be set forth in a tabular form. Her capacity of definition might be easily stated at a very low figure, her mathematical knowledge at nothing, yet he was not sure that if he had been required, for example, to tick her off into columns in a parliamentary return, he would have quite known how to divide her. In some stages of his manufacture of the human fabric, the processes of time were very rapid. Young Thomas and Sissy being both at such a stage of their working up, these changes were effected in a year or two, while Mr. Gradgrind himself seemed stationary in his course, and underwent no alteration, except one, which was apart from his necessary progress through the mill. Time hustled him into a little noisy and rather dirty machinery, in a by-comer, and made him Member of Parliament for Coketown, one of the respected members for ounce weights and measures, one of the representatives of the multiplication table, one of the deaf honourable gentlemen, dumb honourable gentlemen, blind honourable gentlemen, lame honourable gentlemen, dead honourable gentlemen, to every other consideration. Else wherefore live we in a Christian land, 1800 and odd years after our Master? All this while Louisa had been passing on, so quiet and reserved, and so much given to watching the bright ashes at twilight as they fell into the grate and became extinct, that from the period when her father had said she was almost a young woman, which seemed but yesterday, she had scarcely attracted his notice again, when he found her quite a young woman.
Quite a young woman,
said Mr. Gradgrind, musing.
Dear me!
Soon after this discovery, he became more thoughtful than usual for several days, and seemed much engrossed by one subject. On a certain night, when he was going out, and Louisa came to bid him good-bye before his departure, as he was not to be home until late, and she would not see him again until the morning, he held her in his arms, looking at her in his kindest manner, and said,
My dear Louisa, you are a woman.
She answered with the old, quick, searching look of the night when she was found at the circus, then cast down her eyes.
Yes, father.
My dear,
said Mr. Gradgrind,
I must speak with you alone and seriously. Come to me in my room after breakfast to-morrow, will you?
Yes, father.
Your hands are rather cold, Louisa. Are you not well?
Quite well, father.
And cheerful?
She looked at him again, and smiled in her peculiar manner.
I am as cheerful, father, as I usually am or usually have been.
That's well,
said Mr. Gradgrind. So he kissed her and went away, and Louisa returned to the serene apartment of the hair-cutting character, and leaning her elbow on her hand, looked again at the short-lived sparks that so soon subsided into ashes.
"Are you there, Lou?"
said her brother, looking in at the door. He was quite a young gentleman of pleasure now, and not quite a prepossessing one.
Dear Tom,
she answered, rising and embracing him.
how long it is since you've been to see me.
"Why, I've been otherwise engaged, Lou, in the evenings. In the daytime old Bounderby has been keeping me at it rather. But I touch him up with you when he comes at it too strong, and so we preserve an understanding. I say, has father said anything particular to you today or yesterday, Lou?"
No, Tom, but he told me tonight that he wished to do so in the morning.
"Ah, that's what I mean,"
said Tom,
"do you know where he is tonight?"
with a very deep expression.
No.
"Then I'll tell you. He's with old Bounderby. They are having a regular confab together up at the bank. Why at the bank, do you think? Well, I'll tell you again. To keep Mrs. Sparsit's ears as far off as possible, I expect."
With her hand upon her brother's shoulder, Louisa still stood looking at the fire. Her brother glanced at her face with a greater interest than usual, and encircling her waist with his arm, drew her coaxingly to him.
"You are very fond of me, ain't you, Lou?"
Indeed I am, Tom, though you do let such long intervals go by without coming to see me.
"Well, sister of mine, when you say that, you are near my thoughts. We might be so much oftener together, mightn't we? Always together almost, mightn't we? It would do me a great deal of good if you were to make up your mind to I know what, Lou. It would be a splendid thing for me. It would be uncommonly jolly."
Her thoughtfulness baffled his cunning scrutiny. He could make nothing of her face. He pressed her in his arm and kissed her cheek. She returned the kiss, but still looked at the fire.
"I say, Lou, I thought I'd come and just hint to you what was going on, though I suppose you'd most likely guess, even if you didn't know. I can't stay because I'm engaged to some fellows tonight. You won't forget how fond you are of me?"
No, dear Tom, I won't forget.
"That's a capital girl,"
said Tom.
"Goodbye, Lou."
She gave him an affectionate good night, and went out with him to the door, whence the fires of Coketown could be seen, making the distance lurid. She stood there, looking steadfastly towards them, and listening to his departing steps. They retreated quickly, as glad to get away from Stone Lodge, and she stood there yet, when he was gone and all was quiet. It seemed as if, first in her own fire within the house, and then in the fiery haze without, she tried to discover what kind of woof old Time, that greatest and longest established spinner of all, would weave from the threads he had already spun into a woman. But his factory is a secret place, his work is noiseless, and his hands are mutes. End of chapter 14. Of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 15. Father and Daughter. Although Mr. Gradgrind did not take after Blue Beard, his room was quite a blue chamber in its abundance of blue books. Whatever they could prove, which is usually anything you like, they proved there, in an army constantly strengthening by the arrival of new recruits. In that charmed apartment the most complicated social questions were cast up, got into exact totals, and finally settled, if those concerned could only have been brought to know it. As if an astronomical observatory should be made without any windows, and the astronomer within should arrange the starry universe solely by pen, ink, and paper, so Mr. Gradgrind, in his observatory, and there are many like it, had no need to cast an eye upon the teeming myriads of human beings around him, but could settle all their destinies on a slate, and wipe out all their tears with one dirty little bit of sponge. To this observatory, then, a stern room with a deadly statistical clock in it, which measured every second with a beat like a rap upon a coffin-lid, Louisa repaired on the appointed morning. A window looked towards Coketown, and when she sat down near her father's table, she saw the high chimneys and the long tracts of smoke looming in the heavy distance gloomily.
"My dear Louisa,"
said her father,
"I prepared you last night to give me your serious attention in the conversation we are now going to have together. You have been so well trained, and you do, I am happy to say, so much justice to the education you have received, that I have perfect confidence in your good sense. You are not impulsive, you are not romantic, you are accustomed to view everything from the strong, dispassionate ground of reason and calculation. From that ground alone I know you will view and consider what I am going to communicate."
He waited, as if he would have been glad that she said something, but she said never a word.
"Louisa, my dear, you are the subject of a proposal of marriage that has been made to me."
Again he waited, and again she answered not one word. This so far surprised him as to induce him gently to repeat,
"A proposal of marriage, my dear."
To which she returned, without any visible emotion whatever,
I hear you, father. I am attending, I assure you.
"Well,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, breaking into a smile, after being for a moment at a loss.
"You are even more dispassionate than I expected, Louisa. Or perhaps you are not unprepared for the announcement I have it in charge to make."
I cannot say that, father, until I hear it. Prepared or unprepared, I wish to hear it all from you. I wish to hear you state it to me, father.
Strange to relate, Mr. Gradgrind was not so collected at this moment as his daughter was. He took a paper knife in his hand, turned it over, laid it down, took it up again, and even then had to look along the blade of it, considering how to go on.
"What you say, my dear Louisa, is perfectly reasonable. I have undertaken then to let you know that, in short, that Mr. Bounderby has informed me that he has long watched your progress with particular interest and pleasure, and has long hoped that the time might ultimately arrive when he should offer you his hand in marriage. That time to which he has so long and certainly with great constancy looked forward is now come. Mr. Bounderby has made his proposal of marriage to me, and has entreated me to make it known to you, and to express his hope that you will take it into your favourable consideration."
Silence between them. The deadly statistical clock very hollow, the distant smoke very black and heavy.
Father,
said Louisa,
do you think I love Mr. Bounderby?
Mr. Gradgrind was extremely discomfited by this unexpected question.
"Well, my child, I really cannot take upon myself to say."
Father,
pursued Louisa, in exactly the same voice as before,
do you ask me to love Mr. Bounderby?
"My dear Louisa, no, no, I ask nothing."
Father,
she still pursued,
does Mr. Bounderby ask me to love him?
"Really, my dear,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"it is difficult to answer your question."
Difficult to answer it yes or no, father?
"Certainly, my dear, because—"
Here was something to demonstrate, and it set him up again.
Because the reply depends so materially, Louisa, on the sense in which we use the expression. Now, Mr. Bounderby does not do you the injustice, and does not do himself the injustice, of pretending to anything fanciful, fantastic, or, I am using synonymous terms, sentimental. Mr. Bounderby would have seen you grow up under his eyes to very little purpose, if we could go so far to forget what is due to your good sense, not to say to his, as to address you from any such ground. Therefore, perhaps the expression itself, I merely suggest this to you, my dear, may be a little misplaced.
What would you advise me to use in its stead, father?
My dear Louisa,
said Mr. Gradgrind, completely recovered by this time,
I would advise you, since you ask me, to consider this question as you have been accustomed to consider every other question, simply as one of tangible fact. The ignorant and giddy may embarrass such subjects with irrelevant fancies and other absurdities that have no existence properly viewed, really no existence, but it is no compliment to you to say that you know better. Now, what are the facts of this case? You are, we will say in round numbers, 20 years of age. Mr. Bounderby is, we will say, in round numbers, 50. Now, there is some disparity in your respective years, but in your means and positions there is none. On the contrary, there is a great suitability. Then the question arises, is this one disparity sufficient to operate as a bar to such a marriage? In considering this question, it is not unimportant to take into account the statistics of marriage, so far as they have yet been obtained in England and Wales. I find, on reference to the figures, that a large proportion of these marriages are contracted between parties of very unequal ages, and that the elder of these contracting parties is, in rather more than 3/4 of these instances, the bridegroom. It is remarkable, as showing the wide prevalence of this law, that among the natives of the British possessions in India, also in a considerable part of China, and among the Kalmucks of Tartary, the best means of computation yet furnished by us travellers yield similar results. The disparity I have mentioned, therefore, almost ceases to be disparity, and virtually all but disappears.
What do you recommend, father?
asked Louisa, her reserved composure not in the least affected by these gratifying results.
That I should substitute for the term I used just now, for the misplaced expression.
Louisa,
returned her father,
it appears to me that nothing can be plainer. Confining yourself rigidly to fact, the question of fact you state to yourself is, does Mr. Bounderby ask me to marry him? Yes, he does. The sole remaining question then is, shall I marry him? I think nothing can be plainer than that.
Shall I marry him?
repeated Louisa, with great deliberation.
Precisely. And it is satisfactory to me, as your father, my dear Louisa, to know that you do not come to the consideration of that question with the previous habits of mind and habits of life that belong to many young women.
No, father,
she returned.
I do not.
I now leave you to judge for yourself,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
I have stated the case as such cases are usually stated among practical minds. I have stated it as the case of your mother and myself was stated in its time. The rest, my dear Louisa, is for you to decide.
From the beginning she had sat looking at him fixedly. As he now leaned back in his chair and bent his deep-set eyes upon her in his turn, perhaps he might have seen one wavering moment in her, when she was impelled to throw herself upon his breast and give him the pent-up confidences of her heart. But to see it, he must have overleaped at a bound The artificial barriers he had for many years been erecting between himself and all those subtle essences of humanity which will elude the utmost cunning of algebra, until the last trumpet ever to be sounded shall blow even algebra to wreck. The barriers were too many and too high for such a leap. With his unbending, utilitarian, matter-of-fact face, he hardened her again, and the moment shot away into the plumbless depths of the past, to mingle with all the lost opportunities that are drowned there. Removing her eyes from him, she sat so long looking silently towards the town, that he said at length,
"Are you consulting the chimneys of the Coketown works, Louisa?"
There seems to be nothing there but languid and monotonous smoke. Yet when the night comes, fire bursts out, father,"
she answered, turning quickly.
"Of course I know that, Louisa. I do not see the application of the remark."
To do him justice, he did not at all. She passed it away with a slight motion of her hand, and concentrating her attention upon him again, said,
"Father, I have often thought that life is very short."
This was so distinctly one of his subjects that he interposed.
"It is short, no doubt, my dear. Still, the average duration of human life is proved to have increased of late years. The calculations of various life assurance and annuity offices, among the other figures which cannot go wrong, have established the fact."
"I speak of my own life, father."
"Oh, indeed! Still,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"I need not point out to you, Louisa, that it is governed by the laws which govern lives in the aggregate."
"While it lasts, I would wish to do the little I can and the little I am fit for. What does it matter?"
Mr. Gradgrind seemed rather at a loss to understand the last 4 words, replying,
"How matter? What matter, my dear?"
"Mr. Bounderby,"
she went on in a steady, straight way, without regarding this,
"asks me to marry him. The question I have to ask myself is, shall I marry him? That is so, father, is it not? You have told me so, father, have you not?"
"Certainly, my dear."
"Let it be so. Since Mr. Bounderby likes to take me thus, I am satisfied to accept his proposal. Tell him, father, as soon as you please, that this was my answer. Repeat it, word for word, if you can, because I should wish him to know what I said."
"It is quite right, my dear,"
retorted her father approvingly.
"To be exact, I will observe your very proper request. Have you any wish in reference to the period of your marriage, my child?"
"None, father. What does it matter?"
Mr. Gradgrind had drawn his chair a little nearer to her, and taken her hand. But her repetition of these words seemed to strike with some little discord on his ear. He paused to look at her, and still holding her hand, said,
"Louisa, I have not considered it essential to ask you one question, because the possibility implied in it appeared to me to be too remote. But perhaps I ought to do so. You have never entertained in secret any other proposal?"
"Father,"
he returned, almost scornfully,
"what other proposal can have been made to me? Whom have I seen? Where have I been? What are my heart's experiences?"
"My dear Louisa,"
returned Mr. Gradgrind, reassured and satisfied,
"you correct me justly. I merely wish to discharge my duty."
"What do I know, father,"
said Louisa in her quiet manner,
"of tastes and fancies, of aspirations and affections, of all that part of my nature in which such light things might have been nourished? What escape have I had from problems that could be demonstrated, and realities that could be grasped?"
As she said it, she unconsciously closed her hand, as if upon a solid object, and slowly opened it, as though she were releasing dust or ash.
"My dear,"
assented her eminently practical parent.
"Quite true, quite true."
"Why, father,"
she pursued,
"what a strange question to ask me! The baby preference that even I have heard of as common among children has never had its innocent resting place in my breast. You have been so careful of me that I never had a child's heart. You have trained me so well that I never dreamed a child's dream. You have dealt so wisely with me, father, from my cradle to this hour, that I never had a child's belief or a child's fear.
Mr. Gradgrind was quite moved by his success, and by this testimony to it.
"My dear Louisa," said he, "you abundantly repay my care. Kiss me, my dear girl."
So his daughter kissed him. Detaining her in his embrace, he said,
"I may assure you now, my favourite child, that I am made happy by the sound decision at which you have arrived. Mr. Bounderby is a very remarkable man, and what little disparity can be said to exist between you, if any, is more than counterbalanced by the tone your mind has acquired. It has always been my object so to educate you as that you might, while still in your early youth, be, if I may so express myself, almost any age. Kiss me once more, Louisa. Now let us go find your mother."
Accordingly they went down to the drawing-room, where the esteemed lady, with no nonsense about her, was recumbent as usual, while Sissy worked beside her. She gave some feeble signs of returning animation when they entered, and presently the faint transparency was presented in a sitting attitude.
"Mrs. Gradgrind,"
said her husband, who had waited for the achievement of this feat with some impatience,
"allow me to present to you Mrs. Bounderby."
"Oh,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind.
"so you have settled it. Well, I'm sure I hope your health may be good, Louisa, for if your head begins to split as soon as you are married, which was the case with mine, I cannot consider that you are to be envied, though I have no doubt you think you are, as all girls do. However, I give you joy, my dear, and I hope you may now turn all your ological studies to a good account. I am sure I do. I must give you a kiss of congratulation, Louisa, but don't touch my right shoulder, for there's something running down it all day long, and now you see,"
whimpered Mrs. Gradgrind, adjusting her shawls after the affectionate ceremony,
"I shall be worrying myself morning, noon, and night to know what I am to call him."
"Mrs. Gradgrind,"
said her husband solemnly,
"what do you mean?"
"Whatever am I to call him, Mr. Gradgrind, when he is married to Louisa? I must call him something. It's impossible,"
said Mrs. Gradgrind, with a mingled sense of politeness and injury,
"to be constantly addressing him and never giving him a name. I cannot call him Josiah, for the name is insupportable to me. You yourself wouldn't hear of Joe, as you very well know. Am I to call my own son-in-law Mister? Not, I believe, unless the time has arrived when as an invalid I am to be trampled upon by my relations. Then what am I to call him?"
Nobody present having any suggestion to offer in the remarkable emergency, Mrs. Gradgrind departed this life, for the time being, after delivering the following codicil to her remarks already executed.
"As to the wedding, all I ask, Louisa, is, and I ask it with a fluttering in my chest which actually extends to the soles of my feet, that it may take place soon. Otherwise I know it is one of those subjects I shall never hear the last of."
When Mr. Gradgrind had presented Mrs. Bounderby, Sissy had suddenly turned her head, and looked in wonder, in pity, in sorrow, in doubt, in a multitude of emotions, towards Louisa. Louisa had known it, and seen it, without looking at her. From that moment she was impassive, proud, and cold, held Sissy at a distance, changed to her altogether. End of chapter 15.